I played Silent Hill 2 for the first time a few weeks ago. Supposedly it's one of the greatest horror games ever made, beloved by many. I always considered this a fun angle to go into games from, a time so long after release that it can't blow you away with innovative mechanics or graphics, when there's no rose-tinted glasses to get in the way of you and your perception of the games. Unfortunately, the incredible amounts of praise the game has garnered ensures that you can't go into it without some expectations of greatness. Impressively, Silent Hill 2 continues to be a graphical powerhouse on the PS2. Of course, playing it through an emulator with a 1080p resolution helps this tremendously, but there's no denying that most of the texture work and subtle effects, such as the bloody footprints James leaves as he walks through corpses, are pretty exceptional even by today's standards. When I think back to when the game was made in 2001, my appreciation just grows further. Starting Silent Hill 2, the premise is that you, James, have received a letter from your wife inviting you to Silent Hill. It's her handwriting, yet she supposedly died 3 years ago. It's a simple enough premise to engage the player immediately, but vague enough to demand you keep playing right to the end. Now, I can safely say that I was completely unhinged, nervous, and spooked for the first 2 to 3 hours. It's an incredible opening with a slow and steady build and tension, culminating in your first true encounter with Pyramid Head. Before him, though, you're introduced to these amalgamations of flesh who cough and vomit over you whilst they stagger about. I got used to these things after a little while, especially when the roads are open enough that they're fairly easy to avoid. But then when they're knocked down, or already spawned in this state, they skitter about like human insects, and because of my fear of insects, combined with the impeccable sound design, these things got to me a lot more than I expected at first. It's a shame though, this sort of pacing isn't kept up throughout the entirety of James's journey, and as my primary complaint, there's simply not enough new threats introduced to incite continuing dread, making the monsters mundane about halfway through at most. The bosses break up this monotony, if only slightly, but they ended up disappointing me from both a gameplay and design point of view, with only the last one actually engaging me in any meaningful way. Pyramid Head is the first boss, and while he provides an adrenaline rush initially, the fact that you just have to dodge his incredibly slow attacks until he gives up makes him more of a joke than I would have liked. Although, the few other encounters with him are well executed in comparison. The other bosses are more creatures of messed up flesh in different forms. I get scared pretty easily, and none of these made me fearful in any way. I'll concede that the concept of the abstract daddy in the last quarter of the game, after reading up on its symbolism, is pretty terrifying. But I only wish that the meaning behind it was made a little more clear so that I could feel that terror during the fight. Mechanically speaking, the boss encounters are fairly dry and only require you to use the most effective weapon for the job, unloading all your rounds on the monstrosity until it stops moving. Now, even people most enamoured with Silent Hill 2 tend to admit the controls are questionable to say the least. The tank controls make James hard to maneuver effectively. Although I've played enough Resident Evil for that not to be a problem, I can see why it might not be to everyone's taste. The combat is unfortunately lackluster overall, with the majority of my time holding R2 to prepare my weapon and mashing X to smash down on the enemy. Sure, I could use this with guns and not just a steel pipe, but why would I waste ammo when up until maybe the last quarter of the game, melee is just as effective? If it felt good to smack monsters, then this wouldn't really be a problem, but the same animation playing over and over doesn't provide any real satisfaction. I get it. James is just a normal guy and he isn't a good fighter. That's conveyed very well, but it shouldn't mean that he feels poor to hit things with. For example, Isaac from Dead Space has a huge flail he uses as a melee. It's mostly ineffective, yet it always feels good when the hits land with the way Isaac throws into each of his swings. But instead of weight, Silent Hill 2 tries to employ slower animation into the swings to make them feel good, and it doesn't really work out. If anything, this shows the technological limitations of the time, and that the priorities for the game lay elsewhere. It's most evident where the budget went when you see the CG cutscenes throughout the game, another aspect in which Silent Hill 2 holds up surprisingly well. The characters have nuances and the animation is smooth. While there's still that unmistakable, almost plastic look to them, it arguably aids the creepy tension that director Masashi Tsuboyama injects into each scene. The voice acting is also of note, mainly because you'll either be fine with it or completely despise it. In any other game I'd be inclined to rip it to shreds because of the awkward and especially robotic delivery from James. But this is where the setting and psychological horror of Silent Hill really helps it. The voice acting being just as off-kilter as the characters totally suited the game for me. It added to the dreamlike, surreal sense of it all. Nothing felt quite right in the best way possible. Although I have to give special mention to Mary/Maria's voice actor. She did by far the best job with both characters she was given, making Maria feel untrustworthy and sultry, while Mary was innocent and frail in her ill state. Particularly in the letter read by her at the end. Despite not knowing much about her, Monica Shepherd displays such emotion in her voice that you can't help but feel for her, bringing me close to tears with the ending. It's because of strong moments like this that I wish Silent Hill 2 had more narrative-focused segments throughout. It simply felt like there was a little too much running around aimlessly in repetitive corridors, and not enough payoffs for going through this checklist of rooms to explore. Don't get me wrong, there's some wonderful environmental storytelling with notes strewn throughout each area, but nothing that stands out to me as much as the cutscenes and character encounters do. Plus, if I didn't have my lovely chat on hand to tell me when I missed something, I would have gotten far more frustrated than I did. There are so many rooms to check that if you miss a small item like a key, it can take an incredibly long time to eventually find it. So I'd recommend a walkthrough if this does happen to you. Trust me, you're not missing anything by using one. Each location in the game has this initial intimidation that slowly wears off. Some quicker than others. For example, I was really concerned going into the first main location of the block of flats. It took over an hour to get used to the immensely dark and depressing atmosphere. Everything was so claustrophobic compared to being out on the streets. Yet I was almost immediately okay with the hospital, mainly because it felt surprisingly similar to the flats, with only one new enemy type, that being the nurses. There wasn't much new to be afraid of, and it came down to going through each room like clockwork. The streets you traverse to get to these areas were rarely spooky because there's so much open space, enemies are easy to avoid and pose little threat. Those basic enemies skittering out from beneath the cars got me almost every time though. And that's because the sound design, as previously mentioned, is incredible. Each enemy has their uniquely grotesque moans and movements. While I love each of the designs here, I do wish there was some variation in their textures, since almost all of them are made up of flesh stretched and deformed in various ways, although that does give Silent Hill 2 a distinct, if strange, theme throughout. While we're talking about sound, I'd be remiss to mention the fantastic soundtrack by Akira Yamaoka. It's truly one of the standout aspects of the game, being just as subtle as necessary and heightening the tension at all the right times. Playing Dead Space after this game was incredibly jarring actually, since almost every monster in that game carries their own violin, playing it loudly to announce their arrival. I know they're trying to accomplish different things, but I far prefer the more melancholic composition of Silent Hill, and I expect I'll be listening to it for months, if not years to come. So is Silent Hill 2 actually still worth playing, and does it hold up? Well, in terms of gameplay, no, not at all. It's awkward to control and the UI is just as bad. Even the climactic boss fights leave a lot to be desired. Especially Pyramid Head, fighting two of them at a time was incredibly frustrating, especially since it appeared that only their great knife would deal any damage to them, as I hadn't found the rifle. However, does this make Silent Hill 2 irrelevant? Definitely not. The story does a fantastic job of making up for these shortcomings, and while I wasn't enraptured by it as many others seemed to be, it was intriguing enough and had depth in both its characters and psychological mindfuckery to push me through to the very end. And yeah, I'd recommend you do just the same. Just make sure it's the PS2 original and not those awful HD remasters. Even if it's emulated, as long as you have the hardware to run it, then you'll have a horrible time in just the best way.